The planet Azora was a world bathed in eternal twilight, its skies a swirling mix of purple and black, where the sun was barely a memory. Hidden deep within the craggy mountains of this forsaken land was the Fortress of Shadows, a colossal structure that stood as a testament to the cruelty of the Draconis Empire. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, the cold stone walls vibrating with the faint hum of energy fields designed to hold the galaxy's most dangerous prisoners. But Princess Liana of Talon, shackled in a dark cell, wasn't dangerous because of her strength or combat prowess. She was dangerous because of her love for humans, a race the Draconis Empire reviled. Liana's once pristine lavender skin was marred by bruises and scars from months of relentless torture. Her captors sought to break her, to make her renounce her affinity for humanity, but no amount of pain could crush her spirit. She had witnessed the kindness and bravery of humans firsthand, and for that she was despised, branded a traitor to her people, and a disgrace to the Galactic Order. In the shadows of her cell, Liana clung to the one thing that gave her hope, the faintest rumor of a human resistance. Whispers in the prison corridors spoke of a Terran soldier, a phantom who had saved countless lives from the clutches of the Draconis. She didn't dare hope that anyone, let alone a human, would come for her. But still, she dreamed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the hiss of the cell door sliding open. Two towering Draconis guards entered, their reptilian eyes gleaming in the dim light. One of them held a familiar object in his scaly hand, a torture rod, its tip crackling with dark energy. "It's time for another lesson, Princess." The guard sneered, his forked tongue flicking out as he advanced. Liana braced herself, but just as the rod was raised to strike, a faint disturbance hummed through the air, so subtle the guards didn't even notice. She did. Her heart raced, hope stirring in her chest like a flickering flame. Could it be? Suddenly, an alarm blared, echoing through the fortress halls. The guards froze, exchanging wary glances before rushing out to respond to the unexpected commotion. Liana's cell door clanged shut behind them, but the faintest of smiles crept onto her cracked lips. Something was happening, and for the first time in months, it wasn't another torment at the hands of the Draconis. Across the galaxy, Captain James Corvin, a seasoned pilot and former soldier of the Terran Union, cut through the blackness of space aboard his ship, the Spectral Wraith. The vessel was a sleek, stealth-class fighter equipped with the latest cloaking technology, perfect for slipping into the most dangerous places in the galaxy undetected. James had been running covert missions for years, rescuing captured humans and their allies from the clutches of the Draconis Empire. But this mission was different. The intercepted distress signal had been faint, a mere whisper in the void, but it had carried a name he hadn't heard in years. Princess Liana of Talon. The Talons were a pacifist species known for their diplomacy and wisdom, but Liana had stood out for her compassion toward humanity, and now she was paying the price for it. James punched coordinates into his ship's console, his eyes fixed on the swirling, twilight planet of Azora looming in the distance. The fortress where Liana was being held was infamous, nearly impenetrable. But nearly impenetrable wasn't the same as impossible. Just a routine rescue, he muttered to himself, though he knew this was far from routine. The Draconis guards were ruthless, and the fortress was equipped with some of the most advanced defense systems in the galaxy. One wrong move, and he'd be vaporized before even touching the surface. As the Spectral Wraith glided through the planet's atmosphere, James activated the ship's cloaking field, rendering him invisible to the fortress's sensors. The landscape below was a wasteland of jagged mountains and deep ravines, the sky a swirling miasma of dark clouds. The fortress loomed ahead, carved into the mountain's side like a monstrous scar. Its towering spires seemed to pierce the heavens, and the energy field surrounding it pulsed ominously. James's fingers danced across the controls as he brought the ship in low, flying beneath the fortress's main defense grid. He landed the Spectral Wraith in a narrow canyon, far from prying eyes, and disembarked, his black armor blending into the shadows. The air was cold and bitter, and the distant wail of alarms echoed across the landscape. He smiled grimly. His distractions had worked. The guards were focused elsewhere, leaving him a slim window of opportunity to slip inside unnoticed. James moved swiftly, his combat training taking over as he navigated the fortress's labyrinthine halls. The internal layout had been hard to come by, but his contacts had come through. His heart pounded as he made his way deeper into the fortress, guided by his handheld scanner. Liana's life signature was faint but clear. She was alive. After what felt like an eternity of evading patrols and bypassing security systems, James arrived at the lower levels of the fortress. His scanner beeped quietly as he approached a heavy steel door, the final barrier between him and Liana. With a few quick taps on his wrist console, the door's electronic lock disengaged, and the heavy door slid open with a hiss. Inside, the cell was dimly lit, and chained to the far wall was the figure he had come for. Liana. Her head lifted as the door opened, her violet eyes locking onto him with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Who?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Captain James Corvin," he replied, stepping into the cell. "I'm here to get you out of here." For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if unsure whether to believe her eyes. But then, slowly, a smile broke across her face, fragile yet defiant. "You came. Let's just say your signal reached the right person," James said, moving to disable the energy shackles binding her to the wall. "We need to move fast. The whole place is going to be swarming with guards soon." As her shackles fell to the ground with a clatter, Liana struggled to her feet. She was weak, her body battered, but her spirit was unbroken. James wrapped an arm around her to steady her, their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of shared determination. Together, they slipped out of the cell, their escape just beginning. The fortress was vast and filled with dangers, but for the first time in months, Liana wasn't alone. James had come, and with him, a glimmer of hope. Their journey was far from over, but they would face whatever came next together, united by the same goal, freedom. The winding corridors of the Fortress of Shadows were a maze of steel and stone, designed to disorient and confine. But Captain James Corvin moved through them like a shadow himself, guiding Princess Liana with precision and speed. The quiet beeps from his handheld scanner kept him on the path toward their exit, but every step was fraught with danger. Liana, though weak from her months of torture and imprisonment, kept pace as best she could. Her eyes were alert, scanning for signs of trouble, her survival instincts kicking in despite the pain radiating through her body. The scent of damp metal and the hum of energy fields filled the air, reminders of the prison she had been trapped in for so long. "How did you find me?" she asked in a low voice, her breath labored as they ducked into a shadowed alcove to avoid a patrol. James glanced at her, his jaw tight as he kept his focus on the hallway ahead. "A faint distress signal," he replied quietly. "It came from this planet, encoded with Tylon signatures. I couldn't ignore it." Liana nodded, her expression softening with gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would come. The Draconis are merciless. They wanted me to suffer for loving your people." James felt a pang of anger at the thought. He had heard rumors of the Talon princess who had dared to form an alliance with humans, but he hadn't expected to find someone so strong, so willing to defy her captors, even after all they had put her through. "Well, I'm here now," he said, gripping his plasma pistol tighter. "We're getting you out of here." They pressed on, the fortress a labyrinth of death traps and guards. James's skills as a soldier and tactician allowed him to bypass security systems and navigate the complex terrain. Liana's knowledge of the inner workings of the fortress proved invaluable as well. She whispered to him about hidden passages and weak points in the defense grid, the result of months of careful observation during her imprisonment. As they moved deeper into the heart of the fortress, alarms blared, signaling that their escape hadn't gone unnoticed for long. James swore under his breath. Their window of opportunity was closing. They turned a corner and found themselves face to face with a squad of Draconis soldiers, their armored forms blocking the hallway. Liana tensed beside him, her heart pounding as the reptilian creatures hissed and raised their weapons. "Get behind me," James ordered, stepping forward without hesitation. With a fluid motion, he unleashed a barrage of plasma fire, his shots precise and lethal. The Draconis soldiers moved quickly, but James moved quicker, dropping two before they could even fire a shot. One of the remaining soldiers lunged at him, claws outstretched, but James ducked under the attack and delivered a swift strike to its chest, sending it crashing into the wall. Liana watched in awe as James fought with a ferocity she hadn't seen in any human before. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a force of nature. But just as the last soldier fell, the floor beneath them trembled. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the corridor, and James felt a sudden shift in the air. "They've activated the containment protocols," Liana whispered, her voice tight with fear. James turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What does that mean?" She swallowed, her gaze darting to the ceiling where small metallic panels began to open. "It means we need to run. Now." Without another word, James grabbed her hand, and together they sprinted down the hallway as a thick, toxic gas began to pour from the vents. The fortress had triggered its final defense mechanism, a deadly trap designed to neutralize any escape attempt. James's lungs burned as they ran, the gas filling the air around them. His visor provided limited protection, but Liana was exposed, her breaths growing ragged with each passing second. He had to get her out of here. Fast. Through sheer willpower, they reached a security door, and James quickly hacked into the control panel with trembling fingers. The door slid open just as the gas thickened behind them, and they stumbled into an auxiliary chamber, gasping for breath. Liana collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving as she fought to breathe. James knelt beside her, quickly pulling a small respirator from his pack and securing it over her mouth. "Stay with me, Liana," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're almost out." She nodded weakly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but the spark of determination hadn't faded. They barely had time to catch their breath before the door behind them slammed shut, sealing them inside the auxiliary chamber. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the vents clearing the last traces of toxic gas from the fortress's inner chambers. The air here was cleaner, but tension still crackled in the silence. Liana leaned against the cold metal wall, her breathing stabilizing with the help of the respirator James had given her. She pulled it off slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but full of emotion. I didn't think I'd survive this." James, still catching his own breath, shook his head. "I'm not letting anyone die on my watch. Not you." Liana's expression softened, but before either of them could say another word, the room vibrated, a low hum growing louder by the second. James stood up quickly, his hand on his pistol, and Liana followed suit, though her legs still felt weak beneath her. A section of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden passage. James's grip tightened on his weapon, and Liana's eyes widened as she recognized the familiar markings of Draconis technology. "This passage leads to the main hangar bay," Liana whispered, her voice tinged with urgency. "It's the only way out, but—" "But?" James prompted, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Liana's face darkened. "It's guarded by the warden." James's brow furrowed. "Warden?" She nodded grimly. "He's a Draconis commander, but not just any soldier. He's the one who led the charge to imprison me here. He's ruthless, sadistic, and he'll stop at nothing to keep me in this fortress." James processed this quickly. They were running out of time, and the longer they stayed, the higher the risk of capture or worse. He wasn't about to let this warden or anyone stand in their way. "Then we'll deal with him," James said, determination hardening his voice. "We've come too far to turn back now." Liana hesitated, her mind flashing back to the countless times the warden had tortured her for information, for defiance, for daring to love humans. But as she looked at James, she saw something different, something that made her believe in a future beyond this fortress. She straightened, nodding. Together they stepped into the passage, moving carefully through the narrow tunnel until they reached the entrance to the hangar bay. The massive doors slid open to reveal a cavernous space filled with Draconis patrol ships and armored transports. But in the center of the room, standing tall in full battle armor, was the warden. His eyes, cold and reptilian, locked onto them immediately. A cruel smile spread across his scaled face as he raised a massive energy blade, its edge glowing with deadly heat. "You should have stayed in your cell, princess," the warden hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Now you'll both die here." James stepped forward, his pistol aimed directly at the warden's head. "Not today." The room exploded into chaos. The warden charged, his blade swinging with lethal force. James sidestepped the first strike, firing plasma rounds into the warden's chest. but the Draconis commander's armor absorbed most of the damage. Liana, though weakened, joined the fight, using her knowledge of Draconis combat tactics to anticipate the warden's movements. The battle was fierce, the sound of clashing weapons and the hum of energy filling the air. James fought with precision, his strikes aimed at the warden's weak points, but the Draconis commander was relentless. His strength was overwhelming, and each swing of his blade sent shockwaves through the room. But James and Liana fought as one. They moved together, their coordination improving with every exchange. When the warden raised his blade for a final, devastating strike, Liana saw the opening. With a fierce shout, she launched herself at the warden's unprotected side, slamming the hilt of a stolen blade into the joints of his armor. The warden howled in pain, staggering back just long enough for James to take the shot. A plasma bolt pierced the warden's helmet, and with a final roar, he collapsed to the ground, defeated. Breathing heavily, James lowered his weapon. Liana stood beside him, battered but victorious. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they knew. They had survived the worst. But the galaxy would be watching now, and their journey together was just beginning. The warden's body hit the ground with a resounding thud, his energy blade flickering out as the tension in the room slowly dissipated. For a long moment, James and Liana stood in the quiet aftermath of the battle, both breathing heavily, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The air was thick with the acrid smell of plasma fire and the cold stench of burning metal. Liana, still trembling from the exertion, couldn't help but stare down at the fallen Draconis commander. He had been the source of so much of her pain, a looming presence of cruelty and darkness that had haunted every moment of her imprisonment. Now, he was nothing more than a broken figure on the ground. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying the words out loud might make the reality vanish. James looked at her, his intense gaze softening for a brief second. He holstered his weapon and stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," he said gently. "We've still got to get off this rock." Liana nodded, pulling herself together. She knew James was right. They had won this battle, but the fortress was still crawling with Draconis soldiers, and the longer they stayed, the closer the risk of reinforcements. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and pushed the pain aside. James moved quickly toward one of the patrol ships stationed in the hangar. It was sleek, armored, and equipped with cloaking technology, perfect for a quiet getaway. As he accessed the control panel, Liana stood beside him, keeping watch. She was still shaky, but her mind was sharp, scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. It felt almost surreal to be on the verge of freedom, to stand here, alive, with a chance at escape after months of torment. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. James glanced at her as he powered up the ship. "Not long. The Draconis are going to notice their warden's down, and they'll scramble every ship they have to track us. But if we move fast enough, we can slip through their patrols before they even realize we're gone." The ship hummed to life, its engines roaring softly as the hangar bay doors began to creak open. The distant sky of Azora loomed beyond, swirling with dark clouds, a perpetual twilight over the planet. It wasn't welcoming, but it was freedom. James helped Liana onto the ship, his movements efficient but careful. She gave him a small smile of gratitude, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. There was something about him, his steadfastness, his quiet strength, that made her feel safe for the first time in what felt like forever. As they strapped into their seats and the ship lifted off the ground, the fortress below them grew smaller and smaller. The cold walls, the prison cells, the pain, it was all being left behind. And for the first time in months, Liana allowed herself to feel the weight of her escape. But freedom wasn't without its cost. As the patrol ship soared through the atmosphere, alarms blared on the control panel. A fleet of Draconis ships had detected their departure, and red blips began to light up the radar screen. They were already being tracked. "Brace yourself," James muttered, gripping the controls as the patrol ships began closing in. "This is gonna get rough." Liana's heart pounded in her chest as the sleek Draconis interceptors swooped in from both sides. Their ships were faster, more agile, and the sky was suddenly filled with streaks of plasma fire. "Hang on," James shouted. pushing the patrol ship to its limits. He swerved through the incoming fire, dodging blasts as they zipped by, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Liana clutched the armrest, her stomach lurching as the ship twisted and turned, the forces pressing them against their seats. James's hands flew over the controls with an ease that spoke of years of experience. He maneuvered through the onslaught with precision, but the Draconis ships were relentless, closing in with deadly intent. Liana gritted her teeth, her eyes narrowing as she watched the enemy ships closing in. She wasn't helpless, not anymore. She reached for the co-pilot controls and activated the ship's defensive systems. "I've got the shields," she said, her voice steady. James gave her a quick nod, grateful for the backup as he continued to evade the attackers. "Keep them up as long as you can. We just need to break through their formation and hit hyperspace." The battle became a blur of movement and sound. The Draconis ships fired relentlessly, plasma bolts crashing into the shields as the ship rocked under the pressure. Liana's fingers flew across the console, redirecting power to the shields, but the strain was overwhelming. They couldn't hold much longer. "We're running out of time," Liana warned, her voice tight with urgency. "I know," James grunted, his knuckles white as he jerked the controls, barely avoiding another barrage. "But if we can just—" Before he could finish, one of the enemy ships exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Liana's eyes widened in surprise as the other Draconis ships suddenly veered off course, retreating into the clouds. "What the?" James started, but before he could react, another ship appeared on their radar. This one was larger, more powerful, and flying under a Terran signature. Liana's heart leapt in her chest as she recognized the emblem on the approaching ship. "Reinforcements." "Looks like we're not alone after all," James said with a grin as the Terran cruiser swooped in, providing cover fire and scattering the remaining Draconis patrols. Liana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief washing over her as the danger passed. They were safe. For now. With the Terran cruiser providing cover, James quickly punched in the coordinates for hyperspace. The ship's engines roared to life as they prepared to jump, leaving the chaos of Azora and its Draconis defenders behind. The stars outside the cockpit stretched into long streaks of light as the ship broke through the speed of light, hurling them into the vast expanse of space. For the first time since the escape had begun, there was a moment of silence. James leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as the adrenaline began to ebb. He glanced over at Liana, who sat quietly beside him, her eyes closed as if she were finally letting the reality of her escape sink in. "You did well back there," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I couldn't have gotten us out without you." Liana opened her eyes and gave him a faint smile. "I'm not used to feeling useful anymore," she admitted softly. "But thank you for coming for me." James nodded, his gaze softening. "You don't need to thank me. You deserve better than what they did to you." For a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound as they soared through hyperspace. But, despite the relative calm, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Draconis weren't the type to let something like this go, and Liana's escape had surely stirred up more than just a few angry soldiers. "Where do we go from here?" Liana asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of stars outside the window. James frowned, considering their options. "First, we rendezvous with the Terran fleet. They'll offer you asylum. After that, well, the galaxy's going to be a different place now that you're free." Liana's expression darkened slightly. "They won't stop. The Draconis will hunt me down. They'll never forgive me for loving humans, for believing in something better." James turned to face her, his expression serious but filled with resolve. "Let them come. We'll be ready for them." The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, made her feel a strange sense of comfort. Despite everything she had been through, despite the horrors of her captivity, here was someone who believed in her, someone who was willing to fight by her side. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. James didn't respond with words this time. Instead, he gave her a look that said everything. That he wouldn't leave her to face this alone, no matter what came next. As the ship continued its journey through the stars, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by something quieter, something deeper. They were no longer just two strangers. thrust together by circumstance. They were partners, comrades bound by a shared purpose. But even as they hurtled toward the safety of the Terran fleet, James knew that this was only the beginning. The Draconis Empire would come for them, and the galaxy would soon learn of the princess who had dared to defy her captors for love, and the human soldier who had risked everything to save her. And as the stars outside continued to blur, James felt a sense of determination rising within him. He had fought in countless battles, seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. But this was something worth fighting for. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would face it as one. The stars flickered outside the cockpit like distant memories, and the hum of the ship's engines filled the quiet. As James piloted the ship through hyperspace, his mind raced with possibilities. The Terran fleet was still several light-years away, and the Draconis Empire wouldn't sit idly by after such a bold escape. He knew their pursuit would come sooner rather than later. In the co-pilot seat, Liana sat in silence, her hands resting lightly on the controls. Though her body was weary, her mind was sharp, calculating. She had been raised as a diplomat, trained to navigate the complexities of galactic politics. But now it was survival that consumed her thoughts. The Draconis wouldn't just pursue her, they would make an example of her if they caught her again. A princess who dared to love humans? That was treason of the highest order. Liana glanced over at James, her eyes studying his profile as he stared at the stars ahead. There was something reassuring about him, a calm resolve beneath the hardened exterior. He had risked his life for her without hesitation, and now he was her only hope of survival. Yet it was more than that. In their brief time together, she felt a connection, something deeper than just the bond of circumstance. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who had chosen to care about her when no one else would. "James," she said quietly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Yeah? Why did you come for me? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. Why risk your life for a princess of a race most of your people despise?" James hesitated, then sighed, his hands tightening on the controls. "I've seen enough of war to know that it doesn't matter where you're from or what race you are. Good people can get caught in the crossfire just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And from what I heard about you, Liana, you weren't just some princess sitting in a palace. You actually stood up for us, for humans. You didn't have to, but you did." Liana nodded, her heart softening at his words. "I believed in something more. I believed we could build a galaxy where all species, even humans, could live together in peace. But my people, the Draconis, they saw that as a betrayal. I was a symbol of everything they feared: change, cooperation, love." James smirked. "Yeah, I got that impression." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were clouded with doubt. "But now, I wonder if I was naive, if I misjudged everything. My belief in peace has only brought war to my doorstep. Maybe they were right. Maybe we're too different to ever really understand each other." James shook his head, his voice firm. "Don't believe that. It's people like you, people willing to risk everything for something better, that change the galaxy. The Draconis fear that because they know it's the future, they know that eventually, people like you will win. They just don't want it to happen yet." Liana looked at him, her eyes softening, the deep warmth spreading through her chest. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was more than just a princess, more than just a figurehead in a political struggle. James saw her as a person, someone worth saving, someone worth believing in. For a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift, and Liana felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, she wasn't alone anymore. James was with her, and together, they were stronger than either of them had been on their own. But the moment was short-lived. The ship's sensors suddenly blared to life, pulling them both out of their quiet thoughts. "Draconis ships," James muttered, his eyes narrowing as he checked the readings. "They found us." Liana's heart clenched. "How many?" James didn't answer immediately. The look on his face said enough. Enough to make this ugly. They had come too far to be caught now. They had fought too hard. James clenched his jaw and pushed the ship's engines to their limit, preparing for the inevitable. "They're not going to stop," Liana said, her voice tight with determination. "We have to fight." James glanced at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You ready for this? I was born ready, she replied, her gaze steely. As the Draconis ships closed in, James activated the ship's weapons, and Liana took control of the shields. The first blasts rocked their ship, shaking the hull as plasma bolts screamed through space. James flew with expert precision, weaving between enemy fire while firing back with calculated strikes. The battle was intense. The void of space lit up with explosions and streaks of energy. Liana's hands moved over the controls, adjusting power to the shields, keeping them up just long enough for James to maneuver through the chaos. Her heart raced, but she remained calm, focused. She had been trained for this, though nothing in her diplomatic life had ever prepared her for actual combat. James, on the other hand, was in his element. Every move he made was precise, every shot deliberate. He fought with the quiet efficiency of a soldier who had seen too many battles but still held on to hope. The odds were against them, but he had faced worse. As the Draconis ships tightened their formation, trying to box them in, Liana saw an opening. There! She shouted, pointing to a narrow gap in the enemy formation. James didn't hesitate. He steered the ship toward the gap, firing a barrage of plasma bolts that tore through the enemy ship's defenses. The Draconis vessels exploded in brilliant flashes of light, and before the rest could react, James pushed the engines to full throttle, breaking free of the enemy's net. They shot past the remaining Draconis ships, disappearing into the blackness of space as the enemy fire grew distant. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both breathing heavily as the adrenaline began to fade. "We did it," Liana said, her voice filled with disbelief and relief. James smirked, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We're not dead. I'll take that as a win." Liana let out a breathless laugh, the tension finally easing as the stars stretched out before them, vast and endless. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The Galactic Council's chambers were vast and imposing, a place where the fate of worlds was decided. The towering structure floated in the neutral space of Nixia Station, far from any planetary systems, and home to the galaxy's most powerful political forces. It was here that James and Liana had come, seeking refuge after their harrowing escape from the Draconis Empire. But as they stepped into the Grand Hall, they both knew that this was more than just a refuge. It was the beginning of a new fight. James walked beside Liana, his eyes scanning the rows of counselors from dozens of alien species, each one representing a different faction in the galaxy. The counselors spoke in hushed tones, their eyes focused on Liana. Some were curious, others hostile. After all, she was a princess of the Talons, a race that had once stood in alliance with the Draconis Empire. Her defection, and her love for humans, was a scandal that had shaken the galaxy. But there were also those who saw her as a symbol of hope, a beacon of unity in a galaxy torn apart by war and hatred. As they reached the center of the chamber, Counselor Narration, a stern-looking woman with pale blue skin and piercing eyes, called the session to order. She was one of the most influential members of the council, known for her sharp mind and unyielding principles. "Princess Liana of Talon," Narration began, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You stand before this council accused of treason against your people and of endangering the stability of the galaxy by inciting rebellion. What do you have to say in your defense?" Liana took a deep breath, stepping forward with her head held high. She had expected this, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on her. "I stand before you not as a traitor, but as someone who believes in a future where all species can coexist," Liana said. Her voice strong but filled with emotion. "The Draconis Empire has ruled through fear and oppression for too long. They would have me executed for daring to love a human, for daring to believe that peace is possible between us. But I will not be silent." Murmurs spread through the chamber. James stood silently beside her, his hand resting on his blaster just in case. Though he knew this was a battle of words, not weapons, Counselor Nariel's expression remained unreadable. "You claim to seek peace, but your actions have led to violence. The Draconis will not easily forgive your defection, and the instability you have caused could lead to war." Liana's eyes hardened. "The Draconis are already at war, Counselor. War with anyone who challenges their authority, anyone who dares to imagine a future where love and understanding can transcend species. I stand here because I believe in that future." Nariel's gaze softened, just slightly. "And this human?" she gestured toward James. What is his role in all of this? Liana turned to James, her eyes locking onto his. James saved my life. He risked everything to help me escape. Not because I am a princess, but because he believes in the same future I do. A future where we are not defined by the species we were born into, but by the choices we make. James held her gaze, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and something deeper. He had fought countless battles in his life, but this one, this fight for something more than survival, felt like the most important one of all. Neriel studied them both for a long moment, then turned to the rest of the council. The question before us is not one of love, but of the future of this galaxy. Princess Liana's actions have indeed disrupted the status quo, but perhaps it is the status quo that needs to be challenged. I propose we grant her asylum and recognize her as a voice for peace in this council. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, some in agreement, others in outrage. The debate raged on, but in the center of it all, Liana stood tall, her hand brushing against James's arm as if drawing strength from his presence. As the counselors continued to argue, James leaned close to her and whispered, "No matter what happens here, we'll fight this together." Liana smiled softly, her heart filled with a new sense of purpose. Together. It wasn't just the Draconis they were fighting anymore. It was the fear and hatred that had divided the galaxy for so long. And for the first time, Liana truly believed that they could win. In the end, the council voted. By a narrow margin, Liana was granted asylum, her voice added to the Galactic Council as a representative for peace. But they both knew that the real battle was only beginning. The Draconis would not stop. They would come for her, and they would come for anyone who dared stand with her. As they left the council chambers, James looked up at the stars outside the station. He had always been a soldier, but now, standing beside Liana, he felt like something more. "We'll face them," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face them together." And as the stars shimmered in the distance, Liana nodded, knowing that their bond, formed in battle, strengthened by trust, would carry them through whatever darkness lay ahead. The Galactic Council's ruling was barely a day old. Yet the news of Princess Liana's asylum had already spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Celebration from those who sought peace and unity, outrage from the Draconis Empire and their allies, who viewed the ruling as a direct affront to their authority. On Nixia Station, James and Liana were temporarily housed under the protection of the Terran Alliance. But the tension was palpable. They knew this peace was fragile. Hanging by a thread. The Draconis would not sit idly by, while one of their former royals, now a symbol of defiance, openly challenged their rule. James stood in the observation deck of their quarters, his eyes scanning the vastness of space beyond. Stars twinkled in the distance, but his mind was focused on the more immediate threat, rumors of a Draconis fleet amassing just outside neutral space. "They won't wait long," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists. The Draconis had been humiliated, and he knew from his years in combat that they would strike hard, without warning. The soft sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Liana approaching. She had changed from the battered and bruised prisoner he had rescued on Azora. Now, she wore the simple yet elegant attire of a royal diplomat, her posture graceful, her eyes full of strength. But despite her outward composure, James could sense the weight of her decision, the enormity of the role she had taken on. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. James nodded. "The Draconis won't let this stand. They're assembling a fleet. When they come, it won't just be for you. They'll come for the council, for everyone who supported you." Liana sighed, moving to stand beside him. "I always knew they'd come, but I didn't think it would be so soon." James turned to her, his expression firm. "You're not alone in this. You've got allies now. Terrans, Xerians, even some of the other Talon factions. They'll fight for you." "I know," Liana said softly, her eyes meeting his. "But this isn't just a political fight anymore. This is personal for them. I loved humanity, James, and for that they'll never forgive me." James's heart clenched at her words, but he didn't hesitate. "Then let them come. We'll stand against them. You've given people something to believe in. That's worth fighting for." Liana's gaze softened as she looked at him. "You've given me something to believe in, too. Before he could respond, the station's comm system buzzed, breaking the moment. An urgent message flashed across the screen. Draconis ships detected entering the system. Prepare for engagement. James's pulse quickened. It's starting. Liana's expression hardened with determination. Then we faced them, together. The battle erupted within hours. The Draconis fleet, larger than anticipated, had entered neutral space, led by a massive warship that dwarfed the others. It was a show of force, a reminder to the galaxy that the Draconis Empire would not be humiliated without retaliation. But Nixia Station was not defenseless. The Terran Alliance and their allies had anticipated the attack and were prepared. James suited up in his combat gear, his plasma rifle slung over his shoulder as he readied himself for the fight ahead. He could hear the distant sounds of engines powering up and soldiers moving into position. The station's defense grid hummed to life, preparing to engage the enemy ships. Liana stood beside him, dressed not as a diplomat, but as a warrior. Though her role had shifted from princess to ambassador, she was still prepared to defend what she believed in. The gleam of determination in her eyes told James that she was ready for whatever came next. "They're sending a message," James said grimly as he checked the charge on his rifle. "This isn't just about taking you back. They want to crush any hope of resistance." "Then we show them that hope is stronger than fear," Liana replied, her voice steady. The first wave of Draconis ships hit the station's outer defenses with a thunderous roar. Explosions lit up the dark expanse of space as laser fire and plasma cannons exchanged deadly volleys. Inside the station, alarms blared as fighters scrambled to launch and ground forces prepared for boarding assaults. James and Liana moved quickly, joining the defense team stationed near the docking bays. If the Draconis broke through the station's defenses, they would launch boarding parties to take control from within. James had fought in enough battles to know that once the enemy was inside, it became a desperate fight for survival. The first breach came moments later. Draconis soldiers poured through the docking bay, their armored forms hulking and menacing. James fired his rifle, dropping the first two enemies before they even had a chance to raise their weapons. Beside him, Liana fought with a grace that belied her years of diplomatic training, using a plasma blade she had picked up from one of the fallen enemies. The battle in the docking bay was brutal, but James and Liana fought side by side, their movements synchronized as they pushed back the invaders. For every Draconis soldier they took down, another seemed to take their place. But they held the line, refusing to give an inch. At one point, as James took cover behind a cargo crate, he glanced over at Liana, who was dispatching a Draconis soldier with a swift, precise strike. Her face was fierce, her every move purposeful. He felt a surge of admiration, and something more, something that had been growing between them since the day they met. "Liana," he called out, as the tide of battle began to turn in their favor. She turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment, as if sensing the shift in the air. Just then, a massive explosion rocked the station. The central power grid had been hit, and the lights flickered, plunging the bay into brief darkness before emergency systems kicked in. "They're trying to take out the power," Liana shouted. James cursed under his breath. "If they knock out the power grid, the defense systems will go down. We need to get to the control center." They fought their way through the station, pushing past enemy lines as they raced toward the central control hub. The sound of combat echoed through the halls, but they pressed on, knowing that the station's survival depended on them reaching the power grid before the Draconis did. When they arrived, they found a team of engineers frantically trying to stabilize the system. James and Liana immediately took up defensive positions, holding off the Draconis soldiers who had breached the station's inner sanctum. "Hold the line," James barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Liana stood beside him, her plasma blade glowing as she deflected incoming shots with deadly precision. Together, they fought with everything they had, refusing to let the Draconis gain any ground. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engineers managed to restore power, and the station's defenses roared back to life. The Draconis fleet, now outmatched, began to retreat, their warship limping away as the station's cannons pounded their rear lines. The battle was over. As the last of the enemy ships disappeared into hyperspace, a wave of relief washed over the station. The defense forces cheered, and the council members who had stayed behind in the control room began to breathe again. But for James and Liana, the moment felt different. They had won, yes, but it wasn't just about victory. It was about something far more profound. James turned to her, his face smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes soft with something deeper. "We did it." Liana smiled, exhausted but triumphant. "We did." For a long moment they simply stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, their connection unspoken but undeniable. They had fought for each other, for the future they believed in, and in that moment it was clear that their bond had become something far greater than just comradeship. James stepped closer, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Liana looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Together," she agreed, her voice soft but unwavering. As the stars outside the station twinkled once more, no longer dimmed by the threat of war, James and Liana knew that their fight wasn't over. The galaxy would still face challenges, and the Draconis would no doubt return. But they would face it all with the strength of their bond, a bond forged in battle, strengthened by love, and unbreakable in the face of anything the galaxy could throw at them. And so, as the station's inhabitants began to rebuild and recover, James and Liana stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held, their hearts intertwined with the hope of a new dawn.